Meanwhile, the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Department announced today that a Glen man remains missing. He vanished on December 1st. Sheriff's Office has suspended its search efforts for 56-year-old Calvin Charles Zimdars after 9 days of extensive searching turned up no trace of him. Zimdars was last seen November 30th at his home on Sugarloaf Mountain Road in Glen, about 2 miles north of Dillon. Sheriff's Department will reactivate the search if it gets new credible information. Anyone with information about the case is asked to call the Beaverhead Sheriff's Office at 683-3700.
Hello folks, and welcome back to another case study where I discuss and analyze some of the strangest state and national park missing person cases out there. Every so often, I'll cover a case that falls just outside of these state and government-owned lands and into the pastures of our own backyards. It's a cold, hard truth that we don't need to be out in the back countries of Yellowstone or Yosemite to go missing, and that anyone can disappear from the familiar touches of their own surroundings. In this case, I'll be talking about a disappearance that happened in such a setting, and despite an extensive search and rescue attempt, no trace of the man was ever located. So let's begin. It was just about a year ago when on December 1st, 2017, a 56-year-old man was reported missing by his family members after disappearing outside of his rural home in the far reaches of Montana on Sugarloaf Mountain Road. Calvin Charles Zimdars was your hard-working average Joe who lived a simple life alone in his longtime home, 22 miles north of Dillon, Montana, a sleepy little railroad town in Beaverhead County, with a population that never breaks 5,000, even during the summer months. Calvin lived a life of simplicity, spending most of his time at his home taking care of his horse, livestock, and enjoying the surrounding natural beauty of Sugarloaf Mountain and Grasshopper Valley, where he would often be seen hiking, hunting, fishing, and working with his cattle. Family members often visited Calvin and offered to help him out with various projects. So when they arrived on the morning of Friday, December 1st, everything looked as it usually did. His horse and cattle were out grazing off the land. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and both of Calvin's vehicles were still in their driveway. Everything seemed normal, except that Calvin was nowhere to be seen. Immediately, this raised some red flags with the family members, because Calvin would not leave the place unattended to for too long, and it looked as though he could return at any moment, but he never did. Several attempts were made to contact Calvin, but he left everything including his phone, wallet, and keys in the home. There was no indication that Calvin had left or even planned to be gone for very long. A short time later, authorities were contacted, thus kicking off an extensive, week-long search involving hundreds of personnel from several different search and rescue outfits from surrounding counties. I was unable to find any specific information about the family members who came to visit Calvin, but some articles state that it was his adult children and former spouse who would eventually help participate in the search effort. Calvin is described as 5'7", weighs about 170 pounds, has salt and pepper colored hair, and was last seen wearing Western apparel, including a large belt buckle and Wrangler jeans. Family members believe it was possible he may have went for a short hike into the hills surrounding his home, and having spent decades there, he was quite familiar with the terrain and surrounding territories. On December 2nd, the day after he was reported missing, the official search began. A search and rescue command post was set up near Calvin's home on Sugarloaf Mountain Road, and all persons entering the search area were interviewed and made aware of the missing man. They were also required to check in with authorities. Before we get into the details behind the search, I wanted to read the following press release as it may shed some light on the circumstances behind his disappearance. The Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office continues to investigate the report of a missing person from the Sugarloaf Mountain Road area near Glen, 22 miles north of Dillon. Calvin Charles Zimdars, a 56-year-old white male, was reported missing by family members on Friday night, December 1st, 2017. There are some indications Zimdars might have felt despondent about the circumstances of recent life events. He had turned out his horse so he could graze on its own and not rely on feed, an action officials believe could be an indication Zimdars did not expect to return home. I was unable to find any specifics on what these recent events were or whether or not Calvin was suffering from depression. There's just not a whole lot of information on what his mental or even physical state was, but I assume he was in somewhat good physical health at the very least, given the amount of work he put into the ranch. Beaverhead Search and Rescue and the Sheriff's Office kicked off a week-long search, first involving several K-9 teams to supplement the ground operations, and by the third day, dozens more personnel filtered into the area and began to expand their search zone. Professional searchers and volunteers, now numbering in the hundreds, covered several square miles of the area in and around Grasshopper Valley, with emphasis given to areas that Calvin was known to frequent, such as Sagebrush Creek, Bannack Bench Road, and even Sugarloaf Mountain. The search utilized ATVs, rangers on horseback, search dogs, technical specialists, and aerial resources. All surrounding bodies of water in the area were looked at as well. By days 5 and 6, a comprehensive missing person flyer provided by the family began circulating around Glen, Dillon, and nearby communities as well as on Facebook. However, despite all these efforts, not a single trace of Calvin ever surfaced. After day 7, the official search was suspended, though family members and volunteers would keep the search active a while longer. I also wanted to mention that if you do an online search for Calvin, you'll find another Calvin Charles Zimdars, a 37-year-old man who passed away this year due to an auto accident. So just a heads up if you plan on doing any research on him, and to not get the two confused. Let's go ahead and talk about the area where Calvin went missing, just to give you an idea of what searchers were up against. According to southwestmountain.com and summitpost.org, Glen, Montana lies in a narrow mountain valley between the Big Hole and Beaverhead rivers. Glen is a popular hideaway for anglers and contains two of the best fly fishing destinations in Montana. As for Sugarloaf Mountain, it is described as a silent giant, looming over southern Bitterroots in the Soloway Bitterroot Wilderness, seldom seeing visitors despite being visible from nearby Highway 93. This mountain is lonely for a good reason. The base of the mountain is over 5 miles from the nearest trailhead in the Soloway Bitterroot Wilderness, and there aren't any good ways to get on top according to those who scale it. But once you reach the summit, the result is a peak well worth the effort, as well as providing most probable solitude even on the weekend ascents. Sugarloaf is probably most often viewed from the summit of Trapper Peak to the south, as none of the other close-by peaks have trails to the top, and often have rugged approaches. Hart, Tamarack, and Chafin lakes lie within the western base of Sugarloaf, and appear to provide good fishing as well as excellent scenery and campsites. The hike to the lakes is relatively easy, and is a great place to take someone on an easy backpacking trip. As for Grasshopper Valley, I was unable to find much of anything on this area, except for some map images that I'll be including in this video. So what on earth could have happened to Calvin? Well, let's throw some ideas out there on the table. The first thing that comes to mind is that Calvin wanted to disappear. For reasons unknown, he may have wanted to end it all. It's just possible he may have been depressed or suicidal, or just wanted to run away and start a new life altogether? Was he in some kind of financial trouble? Was he having a hard time coping with these quote-unquote recent events mentioned in the press release? If he did decide to end his life, why weren't searchers able to find him? Both his vehicles were left behind at the home, and there's no indication he was picked up by anyone else. Also, we need to consider the state of how things were left, the livestock, the condition of the home in general. It was left in a manner that indicated Calvin was either nearby or intended to return shortly. But did he intentionally leave it this way? Was it easier just to walk away from everything and let the family take care of things? Next, was Calvin picked up and taken somewhere else? It was not stated whether or not Calvin had any close friends or enemies that he may have had plans with, but we need to keep that door open. We know that Calvin was an avid hiker, hunter, and fisherman. Is it possible he had plans with a buddy, and if so, did something go wrong? If this is the case, I believe that whatever happened far away from the home due to the lack of evidence. There was no evidence to suggest robbery or foul play took place. And all of Calvin's belongings were untouched and the entire property searched for any clues. Again, the condition of his home pointed to the fact that he wouldn't be gone for very long. Finally, was the family involved somehow? Could one or more of the family members be responsible for his disappearance? It wouldn't be the first time something like it has happened. We've all heard the stories involving family members harming each other for a number of reasons. Was there a feud or financial conflict going on between them that we just don't know about? If so, it's possible Calvin may have disappeared much earlier than the family reported, as this would have given them plenty of time to commit the crime, cover it, and stage things to throw off investigators. Well, I would assume that police interviewed and cleared the family before moving on with their search. If there was any suspicion or motive, I believe investigators would have found evidence for it, and it would have been mentioned in the news articles. But nothing points to this scenario. I also don't believe this was the case based on evidence, or the lack thereof. So what do we have left? Well, this case falls into a unique category, doesn't it? A category in which many of the strange disappearances that I cover keep on falling into. If Calvin didn't leave on his own accord, or wasn't taken forcibly, then what else is there? What are we not seeing? That's where you come in, and I'd like to hear from you. Perhaps we can work together to find a viable answer and provide some closure for Calvin's loved ones. Perhaps we'll know the truth in due time, but until then, we can only speculate what may have happened based on what we do and don't know. Thanks for joining me on this episode, and may we never forget the sad and strange disappearance of Calvin Charles Zimdars.